the roar of a lion silenced by greed. Beneath a smoldering sun, the plains of Cannae awaited their reckoning. The winds carried whispers of dread as two armies faced each other, one brimming with arrogance, the other honed by survival, as if the gods themselves paused to watch what would unfold. The year was 216 BC, and on that day, the fate of the ancient world hung by a thread woven by Hannibal Barca, a man whose name would echo through eternity. Hannibal had arrived on the Italian peninsula like a thunderbolt hurled from a distant storm. His journey was the stuff of legend, a daring crossing of the snow-choked Alps, where men and beasts alike had been claimed by the mountains. Yet, he had emerged victorious, with fire in his eyes and Rome's doom clutched in his grasp. Each step had brought him closer to this moment, where the pride of the Republic would meet its reckoning. Arrayed against him stood the vast legions of Rome, their red standards fluttering like the tongues of 1,000 serpents. They were commanded by two consuls, Paulus and Varro, proud sons of Rome, whose overconfidence would lead them into Hannibal's snare. These men believed in numbers, in sheer force of will. But Hannibal, ever the cunning predator, understood that strength alone could not decide the fates of empires. The battlefield was set. The Romans, sensing victory, advanced like an unstoppable flood. Their legions were a solid wall of iron and leather, their disciplined ranks forged by the hammer of empire. To them, Hannibal was but a foreign upstart, a shadow to be dispersed by the sun of Roman might. Little did they know, they were already dead men walking. Hannibal, his weathered face betraying nothing but grim determination, placed his infantry in a crescent formation. In the center, he stationed his weakest troops, Spaniards and Gauls, whose wild eyes and tribal scars belied the courage burning within them. Flanking these were his Libyan infantry, disciplined, hardened men who had tasted Roman blood before. And on the wings, Hannibal's cavalry, his trusted Numidian horsemen, sharp as the scorpions of the desert, waited for the moment to strike. As the legions surged forward, the Roman consuls watched with satisfaction. The center of Hannibal's line bent, retreating under the pressure of Rome's advance. Varro's eyes gleamed with triumph. This was what they had planned for, an overwhelming assault to break Hannibal in one devastating blow. The Carthaginian line buckled, drawing the Romans ever deeper, luring them into the heart of Hannibal's trap. For Hannibal had seen this battle long before it began. He knew his enemy's mind as well as his own, anticipated their every move with the patience of a master hunter. And as the Roman legions pushed deeper, they found themselves enveloped slowly, like prey encircled by wolves. The Libyan infantry, standing firm on the wings, began to close in. What had seemed like a retreat was revealed as a deadly embrace. The trap was sprung. Suddenly, as if by divine command, Hannibal's cavalry thundered into action. Led by the fearless Hannibal, the Numidians swept away the Roman cavalry like leaves before a storm, outflanking the enemy and charging at their exposed rear. The legions, now surrounded on all sides, fought in a space growing tighter by the second. Spears and shields clashed, screams of agony filled the air, and the once disciplined ranks of Rome dissolved into chaos. Hannibal stood atop a ridge, watching the slaughter unfold, his presence like that of an ancient war god. There was no escape for the Romans. They were trapped, suffocating in their own numbers. The fields ran red with blood as tens of thousands fell where they stood, crushed by the weight of their comrades or cut down by Hannibal's men. This was no mere battle, it was annihilation. The pride of Rome was being fed to the wolves. And yet, even as the sun dipped low and the cries of the dying filled the heavens, Hannibal did not smile. Victory was his, yes. But he knew, oh, how he knew, that this was not the end. Rome was like a hydra, cut off one head, and another would rise. And though the path to Rome lay open, Hannibal hesitated. Was it doubt? Was it wisdom? The history books would debate the reason for centuries. But in truth, Hannibal's instincts told him that even in this, the Republic had hidden strengths, invisible to the battlefield. Back in Carthage, the forces that would undo Hannibal's work were already in motion. Far from the clashing swords and dying legions, men of wealth and influence whispered in dark corners, their ambition poisoning the heart of Carthage. The city that had once been the pride of the ancient world, its walls soaked with the spirit of the Phoenicians and the mysticism of ages past, had become a hive of intrigue. Power, not honor, ruled its streets, and those in command feared Hannibal's growing fame. Behind the scenes, the Blues, an ancient order that moved in shadows, slowly eroded the support for Hannibal's campaigns. They cared not for Carthage's survival, nor for the legacy of its people. Wealth and influence were their gods, and they worked to undermine Hannibal's victories with subtle treachery. While he waged war abroad, his homeland was being sold piece by piece to the highest bidder. His cries for reinforcements, for supplies, went unanswered, as the hidden hands of Carthage sought to bind him in failure. For 15 years, Hannibal fought in Italy, his presence an ever-present nightmare for Rome. Yet even as he stood undefeated in the field, his war was doomed to falter from within. The grand vision he held, the destruction of Rome and the resurgence of the old world, was slipping away, undone by the very people he fought to protect. They had forgotten their ancient ways, their connection to the gods of old, and the wisdom that had guided them since the days of Leo and beyond. Instead, they bowed to the whispers of power, to the lure of silver and gold. At last, Hannibal was called back to Carthage. Not in triumph, but in desperation. The wolves were at Carthage's door now, as Rome, having rebuilt its strength, took the fight to Africa. Hannibal returned to defend the city, a warrior grown weary by betrayal. He faced the Roman general Scipio at Zama, and though the battle was fierce, Hannibal knew it was lost before it began. Not by the hands of Roman soldiers, but by the invisible daggers of those who had betrayed him at home. The great Hannibal Barca fell not because he was outwitted in battle, but because the heart of his people had been poisoned by greed. And as the sun set on that fateful day, in the silence after Zama, one could almost hear it, the faintest whisper of the gods, as if they, too, mourned the fall of Hannibal, the last great lion of Carthage. Long after Hannibal's defeat at Zama, a shadow lingered over Carthage. The once great city stood defiant, its soaring walls rising like the remnants of an ancient world. But behind those walls, a sickness festered, a sickness that began not with the swords of Rome, but in the halls of Carthage itself. The city that had once ruled the waves, that had shaped the world with its vast networks of trade, knowledge, and influence, was crumbling from within. The old ways had vanished, buried beneath greed, corruption, and the treachery of those who bowed to the Blues. The year was 146 BC, and Carthage was dying. It had taken Rome over a century to finish what they and the Blues had started. After a century of bitter warfare, the great Carthage had fallen, not just to the might of Roman legions, but to the corruption festering within. Men were bought off, loyalties were swayed by coin, and division seeped into the very heart of the city. What had begun as Hannibal's defiant campaign to protect Carthage had slowly been undone by forces working in the shadows. The Blues, ever the puppet masters, had orchestrated the slow demise of Carthage from within, pulling the strings of both Carthage and Rome. What had once been a city governed by a palace economy where resources flowed for the welfare of all, where the wealth of the empire was shared in careful balance, had become a hollow shell of its former self. The ancient ways, the system that had sustained Carthage's prosperity centuries before, were gone, replaced by greed, corruption, and betrayal. What started as a subtle influence turned darker as Carthage allowed its soul to erode under the weight of silver. Leaders were no longer fighting for the glory of the city or the ancient gods. They fought for themselves, for the promises whispered by the Blues, who saw the city as a prize to be taken, its power too great to be left unchecked. Carthage had once been the jewel of the Mediterranean, but by the time Rome struck its final blow, the city had already fallen to internal rot. Rome, patient as ever, waited until Carthage's heart had withered, then struck. The final siege came with the force of a storm long brewing. The proud ancient people of Carthage had defied Rome's ultimatum to surrender unconditionally, and now, Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of the great Scipio who had bested Hannibal, was given the task of finishing what his ancestor had started. The Roman legions surrounded Carthage like a tightening noose, cutting off all supplies, all hope. For 3 long years, the city held, but it was as if the gods themselves had abandoned the once mighty city. Hunger gnawed at the population, disease spread like wildfire, and within the towering walls, desperation reigned. Carthage did not die easily. Like a cornered lion, it lashed out with fury. Its people fought with a ferocity born of hopelessness. Men, women, even children took up arms, defending the last vestiges of their tradition, their homes, and their families. The massive ancient walls, which had stood since the days when Carthage was the jewel of the Mediterranean, repelled attack after attack. But it was only a matter of time. And then the day came. The Romans breached the walls. The city was thrown into chaos. The streets ran with blood as Roman soldiers poured into the city like an unstoppable tide. But it was not just the sword that would destroy Carthage. First, the Romans went for the libraries. Those ancient repositories of knowledge, filled with scrolls and manuscripts, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, these were Carthage's true treasures. The knowledge they contained was deemed too dangerous, too foreign, too powerful to be left in the hands of the people. The libraries were looted, the best of Carthage's knowledge taken back to Rome, where it would be hidden, studied, used. But what the Romans could not use, they destroyed. Fires raged as centuries of knowledge went up in smoke. The words of Carthaginian philosophers, scientists, and explorers were erased from the earth. The history of Carthage, once a beacon of enlightenment, was turned to ash. And then the slaughter began. The Roman soldiers showed no mercy. The streets of Carthage became rivers of blood as the population was systematically butchered. Men, women, children, it mattered not. The Romans moved from house to house, temple to temple, leaving nothing but death in their wake. The priests of Baal, those who had once stood at the heart of Carthaginian spirituality, were hunted down with particular vengeance. The old gods of Carthage were not merely enemies of Rome, they were enemies of the New World Order. Rome, with the blues pulling its strings, had learned long ago the power of narrative. It was not enough to defeat Carthage militarily, they had to destroy its legacy, its very identity. The priests of Baal were portrayed as blood-soaked demon worshippers, practitioners of child sacrifice, and the horrors of their rites were exaggerated and twisted. The ancient religion of Carthage, with its deep roots in the earth and the stars, was turned into a symbol of evil. Rome rewrote the history of its enemies, ensuring that Carthage would be remembered not for its greatness, but for its supposed barbarity. But the truth was far more complex. The priests of Baal had fought against the encroaching influence of the blues, trying to preserve the old ways, the ancient knowledge that connected Carthage to something far older than Rome. They had stood in defiance of the forces that sought to bend Carthage to their will, and for that, they were erased. The city itself became a tomb. The last defenders, those too proud to surrender, made their final stand in the great temple of Eshmaun, where the sacred fires had once burned bright. But the fires were extinguished. The walls fell. Carthage, the city of Dido, the city of Hannibal, the city that had once rivaled Rome itself, was no more. The survivors, those few who remained, were sold into slavery. The city was razed to the ground, its very existence wiped from the earth. Salt was scattered over its ruins, a final, symbolic gesture to ensure that nothing would grow where Carthage had once stood. Yet Carthage did not die that day. Not truly. For the real destruction of Carthage had begun long before the siege. It began when the city allowed itself to be consumed by greed and betrayal, when its leaders turned from the ancient ways and allowed themselves to be seduced by the promises of wealth and power. The blues, with their hidden agendas and shadowy manipulations, had orchestrated Carthage's downfall from within, long before Rome's armies arrived at its gates. Carthage's fall was not just a lesson in military defeat, it was a warning about the dangers of financial manipulation, of allowing a city's soul to be sold for silver and gold. The tragedy of Carthage was that it had once stood for something greater, something far more profound than mere wealth. It had been a center of learning, of culture, of spiritual wisdom that had endured for centuries. But all of that had been lost, sacrificed on the altar of greed. The story of Hannibal and Carthage is not just a tale of ancient wars, of battles fought and lost. It is a lesson, a stark reminder of the fragility of civilization. For Carthage did not fall because its walls were breached or its armies were defeated. It fell because it had allowed itself to be hollowed out from within. And in the end, it was not the swords of Rome that destroyed Carthage, but the unseen hand of those who sought to control its fate from the shadows. Today, as we look upon our own world, we would do well to remember the fate of Carthage. For though centuries have passed, the forces that brought down that great city have not disappeared. They are still with us, lurking in the corridors of power, manipulating the strings of nations and empires. The story of Carthage is not just a story of the past, it is a warning for the future. Beware the hand that moves in the dark, for it can bring even the greatest of cities to its knees.